Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello again. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Television Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Chad, and on today's show, we are going to be talking about documentaries. I'm going to focus on two documentaries that just hit streaming in the last week. The first is on HBO Max. It's called Q, Into the Storm. It's a 6-part docu-series on QAnon. And then I'll be talking about college admissions scandal, Operation Varsity Blues, a new documentary on Netflix that came out about the college admissions scandal that blew up last year and is still going on. Many of the court cases are still kind of working their way through the system. We'll be ending the show today with my segment, Things I Learned About TV This Week. So make sure you stick around to the end. And without further ado, let's jump into documentaries. So as I like to do for any podcast, I try to do a little bit of digging, little background research on the shows or topics that I'm talking about each podcast. And so I did that for documentaries. I don't know about you guys, but documentary films are not really or series, they're not really my kind of go-to. I'm not a huge documentary guy, or so I thought. And I have a friend who loves documentaries. It's pretty much all he watches. And he just views all different documentaries on all different topics. And once every now and then, he'll shoot a quick text and say, hey man, check this out. So my friend Mark, he was one of the ones that recommended to me that I check out College Admission Scandal on Netflix, saying that he really enjoyed it. And so I checked it out, and I too enjoyed it, which is why I'm talking about it on the show today. So I started doing some research on documentaries, and I started with kind of documentary film, which basically is just a nonfiction that's meant to document reality, primarily for the purpose of instruction, education, or maintaining historical record. And as I kind of dug into documentaries, I found that, one, they've been around a really long time, like really long time. In fact, the early documentaries weren't actual films or shows. They were just short bursts of information lasting like a minute or less. I immediately thought of like a TikTok video. And they tended to capture a single event, like the docking of a ship. And that was kind of the early form of documentaries. And a lot of the reason for that is just technology. They didn't have the technology to be able to kind of do these full-length series and shows and movies as we do today. And so here I'm thinking, I really don't watch a lot of documentaries, but as I continue to dig, I realize that there's a lot of different formats for documentaries. There's documentary film, there's documentary shorts, documentary series, there's docudramas, and each one of them kind of holds or looks slightly different. And when I started thinking about it that way, I realize I actually have watched a ton of documentaries. For instance, right now we watch a lot of nature shows on National Geographic because I have Disney Plus, and so on National Geographic, tons of nature series, and we watch them all, and those are actually documentaries. It's a docu-series about nature. Barbarians Rising on Netflix, a show that I watched and loved. Also a docudrama. It takes real facts and it dramatizes them into a show that we can watch and enjoy. And so I watch tons of those on Netflix, on the History Channel. Anybody that's watched Ancient Aliens, same. And so that was surprising and a little bit eye-opening, and I kind of went, I can't believe I didn't realize that before. But I think I had a mental model of what documentaries were, and that's these, shows like Marching with Penguins and, College Admission Scandal, and that was a documentary. I actually watched far more than I thought. One of the other cool things about documentaries is that in the advent of streaming and social media, especially YouTube, that evolution of how people watch TV shows and consume content has actually really helped support the growth of the documentary genre. Because it makes it so easy, especially YouTube makes it really easy to create that content and distribute it to masses that maybe would not have been accessible before, and it makes it really easy for people to see these documentaries. And so it's really, really cool. In fact, if you look at Netflix and HBO, those are two of the streaming platforms that I personally believe really, really, really do a good job of putting that content, that documentary content out for public consumption. And they do create a lot of those. So documentaries, that's what we're talking about this week. And we are going to start with a documentary on HBO Max. It is a 6-part docu-series. I've watched the first 2 parts. That's what's currently available as of recording on HBO Max. And it is called Q Into the Storm. So to say watching this documentary is like going down a rabbit hole into somewhat of an odd space would be an understatement. And I wanted to try to figure out how best to kind of capture and talk about this documentary. It's one that I encourage anyone who has had even a fleeting curiosity about the phenomenon that is QAnon and how that has kind of infiltrated and permeated our culture in the last year or so, to check it out. Undoubtedly, when you watch a documentary, there's going to be bias. It's very rare, I think, personally, that you have a completely unbiased documentary. They exist, but I think I think of documentaries that I've seen in the past, like Bowling for Columbine, that Michael Moore film, or Hillary's America, which was directed by Dinesh D'Souza, both of which had their own kind of slants, one to the left and one to the right, or extreme right in the case of Dinesh D'Souza. And so what I thought would be a good way into talking about this documentary is to kind of give you a Cliff's Notes of the players, and kind of who's involved at this point, 2 episodes in. and then kind of talk about the episode itself. So that as I'm talking, you kind of have a basis of understanding of who these people are and what terminology I'm using, because otherwise it can get a little muddy, I think. One of the things I like about the documentary is it does have, visual references. And so since we're in a non-visual space right now in this podcast, I figured that would be helpful. So cue Into the Storm. It is a 6-part docuseries on HBO Max. The first 2 episodes are available for streaming now. It was shot over a 3-year period by a writer-director by the name of Cullen Hoback. Now, Cullen, this is not his first documentary. He's done 3 documentaries before this, entitled Monster Camp, Terms and Conditions May Apply, and What Lies Upstream. And he's received some level of kind of acclaim for Terms and Conditions May Apply and What Lies Upstream. He also works as a columnist for publications like The Guardian, and he's given talks and made appearances on several networks, news networks, as an expert on privacy. So QAnon really operates in this space of kind of exercising the First Amendment on a extreme level, and so that's something that they can do because it's online. And so certainly this is a subject matter, this kind of privacy, First Amendment right piece is something that he's familiar with in his background. So he acts as the narrator for this series. Then we have a couple of key kind of characters in this world of QAnon that are important. So we have Ron Watkins, who's the current administrator of 8chan, and lives in Sapporo, Japan. And I'll explain what 8chan is in a minute. We have Ron Watkins' father, Jim Watkins. Watching this show, when you meet Jim Watkins, I immediately made a connection in my mind to Joe Exotic from Tiger King. He's very much this kind of larger than life, borderline, odd, kind of eccentric character, who has a lot of similar kind of traits and things going on to what I saw in Joe Exotic. He's a retired military American expatriate living in Manila, and he operates a number of different businesses. So he has a pig farm, and when we visit the pig farm, which you do in episode 2, there's these jokes about how people, there's a rumor that the pig farm is how he gets rid of the bodies of his enemies and people he dislikes, which is, way dark and morbid, but, he kind of makes a joke of it. He owns organic food markets, and he also owns the channel 8chan, this online channel, and he operates the servers that lives in, which are currently housed in Southern California. Then we have Frederick Brennan. Now, Frederick Brennan, when he was 19 years old, he created 8chan. He's an interesting guy. He is disabled. He has something called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is where your bones don't really form like they should and are extremely brittle, like glass. So those of you who have seen the M. Night Shyamalan movie, Glass, that's what Samuel L. Jackson had. That's the same disease. And it's very rare, that disease. There's less than 20,000 cases a year in the U.S. Of this. And he created 8chan when he was 19 years old and sold it to Jim when he was age 21 after the number of users on the platform had grown so drastically, and he did not possess the knowledge and know-how to be able to scale the site up to be able to handle all the increased traffic. And so he started working with Jim and his son Ron to solve that problem. And in that process, Ron came up with the solution, and Jim offered to buy the site, and Frederick agreed, and then came on as an employee of Jim's, moderating and or not moderating, but helping as an admin to the 8chan site. Okay, so now we get to 8chan. 8chan, the number 8chan, is an image board. So basically, there's other image boards on the internet. The predecessor to 8chan was 4chan, which some of you may have heard of. For those of you who are like me and do not spend any time in any of these kind of chat rooms and spaces and boards, I was like, wow, this exists. So basically, it's an image board where users can indulge in unbridled free speech. So basically, anything goes as long as it's allowed under the First Amendment. It's kind of free range. That includes photos and memes and chats. And it kind of, the reason Frederick created 8chan was he had been on 4chan for a long time, and 4chan is not as free in the respect that it is a moderated image board, and so they do moderate the conversations, and they will pull content down and things like that, which is not something that's done on 8chan. It also, 4chan is not completely anonymous, and 8chan is. So you can literally go on there and talk with no one knowing who you are or having any way of ever finding out. And so I suppose if you were going to engage in some of this really extreme speech, the anonymity is probably a really important thing for those individuals. And then we have Q. Q claims to be a military insider with Q-level clearance and access to Donald Trump. At the time that Q began to come into existence, we were about a year into Donald Trump's presidency. So that kind of timing may be helpful as we continue the conversation. I wanted to know kind of what Q level clearance entailed. Having had parents in the military, I'm familiar with, military clearances. I'd never heard of Q level clearance. And so I looked it up, and apparently Q level clearance, it does exist. It is a clearance designated to the U.S. Department of Energy and is categorized as a national security critical and sensitive position. This level of clearance and the data available to the holders of this clearance is defined in the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. So according to Q, he is a member, former member of the military, or, that has this level of clearance. And then there are these drops. And the drops basically are what they call the posts that Q post on 8chan. These posts are posted regularly, and they're numbered in sequence, and they contain coded messages, warnings, references to a coming storm that would culminate in the unmasking of the deep state, arrests and trials and executions of liberal criminals that are a part of that deep state. So there's kind of this far right accusing people on the left of being part of this larger kind of deep state of bad actions, and that at some point there's going to be this massive kind of action that takes place, whether it's police or military action, where these people would be unmasked and punished for their crimes. So that is kind of the quick snapshot of the characters and terminology that we're going to be talking about as I dive into the first couple episodes. So I'm going to take a break, first break of the show, give you guys a moment to digest that information, and then when we come back, we're going to jump in and start talking about the first 2 episodes of Q, Into the Storm on HBO Max.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC television podcast with your host, Chad Bryce. Today we are talking documentaries. We're going to talk about the first 2 episodes of a new docu-series on HBO Max called Q, Into the Storm. And then we're going to talk about a documentary on Netflix called College Admission Scandal, Operation Varsity Blues. And we are going to wrap up the show with things I learned about TV this week. All right. So now that you've had some time to digest some of the glossary of terms, so to speak, that was dropped during the first segment here before the commercial break, we're going to dig in to this rabbit hole known as Q, Into the Storm. So episode 1, it kind of starts out trying to define what Q is, who kind of the followers of Q are. So the first episode kind of starts talking about Q and who is involved. And we see kind of the start of, right at the top, we're in Sapporo, Japan, and it's a sit-down with Ron Watkins, the current administrator of the channel 8chan. And at the time of the conversation, it's happening between these 2 men, and the one doesn't know that the other is the admin for 8chan. And so it kind of comes up over the course of the conversation. Of course, that's a crazy realization for one of the parties, because he is on 8chan. He uses it. He follows Q, and this is now like he's like the closest he will get, kind of thing, to knowing the identity of QAnon. And then it kind of continues through, and we start to get introduced to all of these people that are in the orbit of this QAnon world. And we see this couple in Florida, and they are talking about kind of who they were before discovering QAnon. And they reference the fact that they were people who voted Democrat, They voted for Obama both times. They lived in a democratic state. And then they had their awakening in 2017. Now, this is where you start to kind of go, okay. And the reason for that is QAnon references a lot of different things. And in that culture, the followers of Q refer to their awakening, which is when they essentially take the red pill. Now, anybody who's a fan of The Matrix knows that the red pill is what Keanu Reeves took to be awakened to the reality of the world. And so that imagery is very present in the world of QAnon. And so this couple had their awakening and took the red pill in 2017, and since then have been following Q and the drops that he's been putting down. Now, the QAnon drops started in October of 2017, and they've continued through the 2020 election. That's kind of the time period that the documentary is focused on. And this is a massive amount of drops. Over 5,000 drops in that period of time, sometimes as many as 10 a day, sometimes with gaps of 10 days. So there's something about kind of this number 10 that seems to be present in the drops. And all of the drops kind of contain these hidden messages, this kind of like code. And you hear, words like the storm, the awakening, where we go one, we go all, which is a reference from the movie White Squall. It's all of this kind of these tidbits of information that people are able to take and latch on to because they're said in repetition. And these codes that are dropped are handled in a very interesting way. So followers of Q take the information that's in the drops and they verify these drops through the use of trip codes, which basically is like a numeric code that's unique to Q, that is in the subject of the post. And so they see that trip code and they know that it's the real Q and not just, somebody pretending, right? So they take this info from the drops and they go on quote unquote digs to decipher their meaning. And then they take their findings and they're talking to people, they're searching the internet. They take their findings and they post their findings online as a way of crowdsourcing the answers. So you've got, thousands, if not millions of people that are reading through these drops. They're taking these tidbits of information. They're doing all this research. They're putting it back out onto the internet where others can see it and weigh in and chat, right? Now that would seem very inefficient. But there's this other level. So there's this other level of followers. So it goes from the Joe Schmo follower who's doing this and going on these digs. And then there's this level called the bakers. And the bakers basically take all of the crowdsourced evidence. They collect it and they bake it into a formal, cohesive thought or idea or deciphering of the drop, and then they post that out. And they post it out in a very consumable form. That form most often is a meme. And then oftentimes those memes are then taken and disseminated by the followers of Q. And what happens with those memes is that they now begin to live outside of the 8chan chatboard universe. and they migrate their way to more mainstream social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. In fact, they've gone so far as to end up on the Twitter account of the then President Donald J. Trump. So this was like really, really seismic in terms of just my thinking about how this became so prolific, so fast, and how it began to kind of permeate everything. Because when you think about 8chan, this is a website, and the documentary covers this. This is a website that exists kind of in the dark, right? You've got to really want to find it to get there. And then there's all of these different boards, these chat boards that you can participate in. And the chat boards range everything from kind of really odd stuff, and I'll let you watch the documentary to learn about some of the oddities that's on there, to more kind of benign things like Christianity and Islamic religion. So there's hundreds of these chat rooms. The content within those chat rooms ranges as well, from kind of the benign to the extreme. And so you wouldn't think that this is going to get very far, but it does, because these memes make the information shareable. It makes it easy to get out there onto other social media platforms. And so that's kind of part of what has led to this just explosion of followers, going from, a few hundred early 2017 to millions by the time we get to 2020. And so these bakers put this out in the form of memes. The memes get shared. People are getting this information. And there are times where Q themselves, whoever they are, whoever Q is taking these memes and also sharing them in their post. And that's when they do that, they often will thank the baker for creating the meme. And apparently the way they thank the baker is in porn, which sounds crazy, but that's what it is. And so, the documentary continues on, and it starts to talk about some of the people in the orbit, some of these anons, which are anonymous members of this world, who all have their kind of anonymous names, right? And they literally live all over the world. In fact, he does an interview with an anon that's in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he's talking to people in Malaysia and the Philippines and Japan, and just all over America, all over the world. These people are existing, and it talks about how these sites like 8chan, they're not new. That they actually started to kind of appear on the internet as early as 1999. And it kind of, the documentary takes you through this kind of timeline of conspiracies or events in this world, starting with Gamergate in 1999, which was focused on an attack of female gamers and journalists, to Pizzagate in 2016, which alleged that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta were engaged in child trafficking, and that their base of operations was the basement of Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C. Now, this ultimately was proven to be false, and one of the details in the series that's given for kind of the rebuttal of this conspiracy theory is the fact that the pizzeria in question doesn't even have a basement. Like, a basement doesn't exist, so how could you have this child trafficking ring in the basement? And then from there, it draws this line to QAnon. And it's kind of inception in 2017. What prompted this documentary was in 2018, QAnon was actually out there. It was on Reddit. And that was the platform that QAnon was using. And it was in 2018 that it was banned. And so the director, Cullen Hoback, being kind of a person who operated and was an expert in cyber privacy, saw this as something happening in real time in the open that was right in that kind of wheelhouse. And so he started looking into it as it went underground, off of Reddit onto 4chan. And 4chan, again, is one of those image sites where it was operating, QAnon was operating and posting drops before moving to 8chan. And ultimately, the move to 8chan was precipitated by the fact that Frederick Brennan created 8chan to get more anonymity and less moderation than he was seeing on 4chan. And then Q saw that as a better platform and migrated over. So then we continue to start meeting more people in the QAnon orbit. We meet some of the owners of pages that QAnon's drops were being housed on 8chan, and we kind of begin to learn about how that individual was kind of the owner or host of this page, and then there's some event that takes place where Q becomes dissatisfied with him, and posts that dissatisfaction publicly, and the fallout of that, and how QAnon then moves to a different board, and this ownership of the board upon which Q is doing his drops is this like honor in this network, and so to kind of hear about this like rise and fall is kind of interesting. And then it also talks about what's known as Q-tubers, and how these are individuals who are followers of Q, who take drops and the associated information that's they come up with in their own digs, and they talk about it, post about it on their YouTube pages. So again, we're seeing something that's kind of in the dark, in the recesses of the internet, that's being pulled out into the light on YouTube. And we meet 3 or 4 of these Q-tubers who kind of are talking about what brought them to Q, why they're doing what they're doing, how it's affected their lives. Many of them have either quit their job or lost their job because of their involvement with QAnon. And so that's fascinating, just really fascinating. And one of the things that I reflected on as the episode is kind of introducing these individuals is these are people who look quote unquote normal. They are your neighbor, they are your coworker, they are your teacher, they are your bus driver. Like, they are just everyday peeps out in the world that believe in and follow this I'm trying to think of what the best way to define it is. This Q. They follow Q. Enough definition. And so then we kind of continue on, and the episode starts to focus on the creation of 8chan and the creator, Frederick Brennan. And we get kind of one-on-one interviews with Frederick Brennan. And so I'm going to take another break. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about the interview with Frederick Brennan and some of the revelations that he shares about his relationship with 8chan owner Jim Watkins. And we'll kind of wrap up my recap of the first two episodes of Q, Into the Storm, the documentary on HBO Max, and then we'll move into a great Netflix documentary on the college admission scandal. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. We are talking about Q, Into the Storm, new documentary series on HBO Max. Where we left off, I started to talk about how in episode 1, there's an interview with the creator of 8chan, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Brennan, who has a brittle bone disease, lives in Manila. So he starts to talk about his childhood and how, because of brittle bone disease, he basically grew up online. He was coding by the time he was 12. He, had been on the internet for a very, very long time. And all of his relationships with people other than his, family, were online. So think about that for a moment. If, all of your relationships are literally taking place online. Not face to face, but, in this kind of digital space. And so this is the world in which he grew up. And he was on 4chan, for a number of years, and began to want for a freer platform for discussion. He didn't like the fact that 4chan wasn't anonymous. He did not like the fact that it was moderated. And so he created his own page, his own image board, which became known as 8chan. Now, there's been multiple chan, which is short for channel. Before that, there was like a 2chan and a 4chan, so you can kind of see how this kind of grows. And he creates 8chan, and at some point, shortly after he creates 8chan, Q moves from 4chan to 8chan and begins doing drops. And it was overnight that this page exploded. Going from a few thousand posts a week to over 10,000 posts a day on this platform. And so Frederick found himself with a real problem. And that problem is he needed to scale up the platform to be able to handle all of this input. But he couldn't. He didn't have the knowledge. And so he met online a guy named Ron Watkins and began working through this problem. And Ron came up with a solution. And so that solution kind of created the conditions for a larger conversation, where Ron's father, Jim, started talking to Frederick about selling 8chan. In exchange, and part of the sale, Jim agreed to fly Frederick from the U.S. to Manila in the Philippines, put him up in an all-expense-paid luxury apartment complex. He was going to provide 24-hour nursing care for him because he needs 24-hour care support, and as well as a salary and a job working as the administrator of this page that he created. And so, Frederick sees this as a great opportunity. And so he packs his bags, he sells this off, he goes to Manila, and he's working for a time as the administrator of 8chan, which he hated. Hated the job. He does not like being an admin. And so they basically have a bit of a falling out, Jim and Frederick. And the thing about this is we don't really know yet in the first 2 episodes what exactly happened between Jim and Frederick. What we do know is that Frederick relinquished the moderation duties to Jim's son, Ron, because he did not enjoy it, and Ron does, and is very good at it by all accounts. And he's not unemployed. He wasn't cut off. He didn't have to leave Manila. He still has all of the perks of this deal that they had come up with, and is still classified as an employee for Jim in his kind of larger company. But there's no kind of discussion at this point of what he currently does. We just know he's still employed. And then we also begin to get an insight into some problems in that relationship, because Frederick starts referencing the fact that Cullen's going to be meeting with Jim, and that he wants to be very careful about how he talks about Jim, and that Jim probably wanted to be a part of this documentary so that he could rebut anything that Frederick might say, kind of thing. So it's this like really odd dynamic that's being introduced here. And then we meet Jim. And Jim, like I mentioned, I mean, he is Joe Exotic from the Tiger King without the tigers and the odd clothes. Kind of this middle-aged dude who was in the military, had spent some time in the Philippines, and learned that the dollar goes a long way in that country. And so he expatriated to the Philippines, and he started a number of different businesses. And from all appearances, seems to have made a fair amount of money on those businesses. And so we start to kind of meet him, and he's kind of all over the place, and he's kind of like a little bit ethereal in the way he kind of talks, but then he's like very caged, and it's kind of like to me it felt like he was kind of putting on an air, like he wanted to seem more mysterious than he actually is, kind of thing, because he's now kind of caught up in this world of Q. Kind of thing, as the guy who hosts the page and runs, owns the servers, and and so he's kind of like Joe Exotic meets evil comic villain kind of thing from The Incredibles. Like it's really, really an interesting kind of profile, and he kind of is talking very kind of laissez-faire about his involvement in Q. Like, he'll say he doesn't know who he is or has nothing to do with him or doesn't follow Q, but then alludes to, conversations they have or knowing Q kind of thing. So it's this kind of back and forth that's crazy. And in stark contrast to this very big persona that is Jim, you have his son Ron, who's kind of this mild-mannered tech geek living in Sapporo, Japan, administrating this page, 8chan, who also, as he speaks more and we get to learn more about him, begins to kind of give this feeling like he knows a little bit more than he's letting on as well. And of course, this documentary, the Cullen is trying to kind of figure out who is Q. He's not just trying to kind of understand this world. He's trying to figure out who Q is. And so, I think that's where we may see a little bit, personally, I believe, there may be a little bit of bias in there because obviously the way the conversations are presented in the docuseries is edited, obviously is going to kind of support his belief or idea of who might be Q kind of thing, right? So I mentioned documentaries undoubtedly have a little bit of bias often, and so this is how I see the bias starting to creep in. And that's really kind of the end of the first 2 episodes. That's where we get to is this idea of kind of how Q got started and how it migrated to 8chan and some of the people that are in the orbit. And I mean, the orbit goes higher than just the Q-tubers. I mean, there's clips and evidence of how the president of the time, Donald Trump, was somehow either following or connected or within a very, small range of distance from Q, and that he would drop these hints or say these things that lead people to believe that it's referencing Q. And one of the things that were in the drops, like a 2017 photo with a number of military officials and diplomats, where out of the blue, the president references that this, what this looks like? This looks like the calm before the storm. The calm before the storm. And the storm is a common kind of thread in Q, in the Q world. So fascinating. First 2 episodes. I do plan to finish the docuseries. It's 6 parts. Just because I'm interested. I encourage you guys to check it out because I found it to be really, really interesting. I personally, if you're just going to watch one episode, watch the first one. It gives you a nice snapshot, kind of all-round view into this kind of culture. And then, if you choose not to watch any more, you at least got that much. But definitely check it out. Q Into the Storm on HBO Max. All right, we're going to take our last break, and when we come back, I'm going to be talking about a new documentary on Netflix called Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal. And we're going to end the show with things I learned about TV this week, so stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. We are going to wrap up today talking about the documentary Operation Varsity Blues, the College Admissions Scandal. This is a new documentary on Netflix that was recommended to me by a friend. You may remember this scandal. It was all over the news. It broke March 12th, 2019, so on my birthday in 2019, yay. And this is the largest college admissions scandal in history. The film is directed by Chris Smith, who also directed Fire, the expose on the Fire Festival scam, as well as Tiger King. So lots of people watched Tiger King. It was a big hit during the pandemic. And basically this expose or this documentary reveals the details behind the largest college cheating scam in history. So basically, this is all about college admissions and how a number of rich individuals paid someone to get their kids into college. What's interesting about this script, though, is that it's taken directly from the wiretapped phone calls between Rick Singer, an admissions counselor that's played by Matthew Modine, and his dozens of wealthy clients who paid to have Rick help their kids gain admission to some of the top colleges in the country using his side door system. This documentary was fascinating. Really cool. It was super awesome that they had the ability to use the transcripts from the wiretaps. I think that really helped to tell the story in a unique way. And I really, really, really enjoyed it. And so, before we jump into kind of the flow of the film and what happens in this documentary, I'll kind of talk a little bit about traditional college admissions. Okay, so anybody who's applied to college knows that it's a very, very stressful time for a lot of high school students. And some of the hardest schools to get into are some of those Ivy League schools, the Yales, the Harvard, but then you also have these really, really big-time schools like USC, Stanford, that people are trying to get into, and more it's getting harder and harder, and so students are having to really go above and beyond to stand out, taking part in all different kinds of athletics and charities and extracurriculars, taking extra AP courses to try to make themselves stand out beyond just the scoring high on a admissions test like an SAT or an ACT. So typically with college admissions, people fill out the paperwork and they submit essays and they submit their test scores, and then it's considered by a group, and some people get in, some people don't. Well, it's long been known that when it comes to some of these more kind of prestigious universities, that there's a backdoor system. So front door is traditional applications, test scores. Backdoor is mom and dad write a check. And that check is a big one and helps pay for a program or a new building or a new upgrade to a facility, a new wing in a hospital, that kind of thing, right? These are things that make it very difficult for the average person to get into some of these colleges and can kind of tip the scales, one could argue unfairly, okay? So Rick Singer, who started out as a legitimate college counselor in the 1990s. College counselors are people that can be hired. They get paid a lot, upwards of several $100s an hour, depending on where they are, the universities they're helping you get into, so on and so forth. And the documentary kind of touches on some of those requirements. And they basically help students to write their essays, and they help them to prepare for their standardized test and review kind of their criteria and help them to figure out ways to stand out in the traditional application process. These are students whose parents don't have a ton of money to go write a big, $10 million check to a university. And so they are paying what they can to help give their kid as much of a leg up as they can. And so that's really what Rick's job is. He starts out in the 90s doing that. And he had this approach where he looked at himself as like a coach, like an athletic coach. And so at the beginning of the movie, it starts with all of these kids that are like sitting at their computers and they're refreshing their email, hoping to get some word on whether or not they were accepted. And then we get to see them celebrate or depressed, depending on if they got accepted or not. And then we see several teachers who had been familiar with Rick or worked with Rick in the 90s, and they're kind of talking about his approach to counseling, admissions counseling. And one of the things that they talked about was that early on, he showed a willingness to bend the rules. So one of the examples that was given is that he would go so far as to change students' race or ethnicity on applications. So that, if he knew the school was looking to increase diversity, then he would change the ethnicity to, accommodate that, so that when you're looking at the piece of paper and not the actual student, you think they're Chinese or, African American or Hispanic or any of those, kind of races or ethnicities. And the thought is that that's how they're making the decision, is based on a piece of paper, not looking at the actual person talking to the actual person. And so if you could change this, bend this little rule, once the kid's accepted, nobody's paying attention to who actually shows up, right? So it's kind of an interesting kind of view that Rick was showing early on. The documentary talks about how after a while he kind of left counseling and he started coaching basketball. And he enjoyed it. It wasn't, what he wanted to do long term. And so he got back into admissions counseling, only this time he started working on this side door operation. So having been a basketball coach at a university, having been an academics counselor, helping people get into universities, he had a very unique view into what universities look at. And one of the things that he saw was that they're not looking at individuals, they're looking at paper. And that by and large, a university admissions committee would agree to pretty much anything that the athletic director and the coach of those sports teams recommended. So if I, as the coach of crew or sailing at Harvard, came to the admissions group and said, hey, I need you to let Bob, Joe, and Susie on into the university because they're top sailors or rowers, and that's going to help us, win the next competition. That was taken at face value that that's what needed to be done, and so those students would get admission. And so Rick's side door system worked by essentially bribing coaches and academic directors at key schools to get them to be open to the students that he presented them for admission. And then he would work with the parents that hired him to say that the students were athletically involved in these unique sports, so sports like crew and sailing and things like that, and go so far as to, Photoshop images and have parents take pictures of their kids on, practice rowing machines or jumping out of the water, hitting, looking like they're playing water polo. He would have the parents help get those photos and would Photoshop this all up to make it look like a student did this, so that the academic director would recommend them, and then they would get admitted into the university. And those students never fielded on the team. Like, they never went to practice. They never made it on the team. And so that was the system. And what made this system, this side door system that he created, so appealing to these individuals, these rich individuals, is that it was a leg up over the traditional front door system of just filling out your applications and hoping you have the scores in the background to make admissions. And it was infinitely cheaper than the back door. So I didn't have to write a $10 million or $50 million check to the university. I could pay you $100,000 or $200,000 to Rick, and Rick would take care of the rest. And so he worked with a number of CEOs, business execs, financiers. That was kind of the main meat of his clientele, were these rich business people, financiers, and CEOs. But he also worked with celebrities, and two of the kind of big names that were talked about a lot when the scandal broke was Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin and her husband, who's a fashion designer, Massimo Giannulli. So the documentary is fascinating because it's taking these excerpts from the transcripts of phone calls that he has and showing and using those words. So it's a lot of scenes of him talking, Rick Singer, played by Matthew Modine, talking directly to athletic coaches, talking directly to the parents that he's working with, and all of them are trusting in his system and are cutting these checks. It's said that over the course of many years, between late 90s when he started this to 2019 when it broke, he had received a total of $25 million from his clients. And this is a scheme that was going on for years. And so you're getting to see all of this happening. Even though it's dramatized, it's in the words. It's from the actual conversations that he was having during these wiretaps his phones were wiretapped for a very long time. And so they have this breadth of information and for the director to work with and putting this script together. And it was just incredible because there was this kind of mix of parents that were like just cutting the checks, not a care in the world, super happy with the results. And then you would see other parents that were a little more hesitant or really wanting to kind of understand what their risk of exposure was if something were to come to light, which was just super fascinating to see. And this continued for a while very smoothly. He was constantly traveling state to state, all over the country, working with different families, continuing to build his portfolio. And a lot of his business was word of mouth. He obviously couldn't take out an ad, and so he things started to kind of unravel in a couple different ways. So according to a young lady who had met him during this period, and he had expressed some kind of romantic interest in, and she had kind of not, reciprocated that interest. There was a point where he started acting kind of erratic. He started doing things like doing a submission for a reality show, trying to kind of get his name and brand out there, which seemed kind of odd to her because he was always kind of a workaholic that just kind of kept to himself. This is not somebody who, tried intentionally to draw attention to themselves, even though he did have a nice house, drive nice cars, that kind of thing. The other thing that seemed to help kind of get this rolling was the fact that Lori Loughlin and Massimo Giannulli's two daughters, one of whom is Olivia Jade, who's a YouTube celebrity, they both got into USC. And some of the students that went to the school began expressing some surprise, according to the documentary, about the fact that they got in, because Olivia Jade specifically was never really one to love school. In fact, there was actual footage from her YouTube page on like the first day of senior year where she's like hating on school kind of thing all day long, live on YouTube for everyone to see, and then all of a sudden comes home and makes some, thing about feeling blessed that she has the opportunities to blah, 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 go to school and this, that, and the other thing, and yet she got into USC. And so did her sister, and USC being this prestigious university, very hard to get into, people started to question, what are the odds kind of thing. And it wasn't just the students. There was an academic counselor at the school who worked for the school, her high school, that started asking questions as well. And it was in that moment that Lori Loughlin and Massimo seemed to get a little bit defensive. And there's a scene where Massimo Giannulli goes into the school and just reads the riot act to this counselor. And that prompts the athletic director to call Rick Singer and say, hey, I need you to get a handle on this because we can't have parents coming into the school and yelling at my counselors and all of that, because he's, this is going to expose us all. And it would seem that it was already kind of too late, because by this point, the damage was done. They were tapping his phones. And so toward the end of the documentary, the FBI, he gets set up by one of the coaches he works with, that had gotten busted for something else. And like always happens, it's like, hey, if you let me out of this, I can give you this bigger thing kind of deal. And he sold Rick out. And so Rick, trying to save himself, agrees to work with the FBI and basically sell out his clients. And the documentary shows these conversations, these taped conversations, where he's literally calling client after client, trying to get them to talk about the work that he did for them on tape for the FBI. And that's really what led to all of the arrests. A total of 50 arrests came out of this FBI sting operation around Rick Singer. And it's been going on now for over a year. There were several high-profile kind of decisions in 2020 where Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman Both ended up serving a little bit of time in jail. There's several clients of his that were arrested and charged and are still awaiting trial, depending on if they pled guilty or not guilty. That kind of seems to have determined how quickly things work through the process. And Rick is still awaiting trial for his charges. It seemed in watching the documentary that they were kind of working through all of the clients and then going to come after him kind of last, and figure out what his punishment will be. It was a fantastic documentary. Really, really interesting. And I love this piece about how the actual wiretaps were used for the script. So I highly recommend checking it out. I want to say it's a lot of fun. It was an enjoyable view, and it moved very quickly. It's like an hour and a half documentary, and it flew by because of how interesting it was. So check it out. It is Operation Varsity Blues, the college admission scandal, on Netflix. All right, we are going to wrap up today's episode with a segment I just recently started called Things I Learned About TV This Week. I am finding that there's all kinds of television news in my news feed, and I consume a lot of news from all different sources on all different topics, and some of these television ones were kind of interesting, and so I thought, why not share them with you? I do take all of the articles that I talk about and all the sources of this conversation, and I post it on the GSMC Television Podcast Twitter feed, so that you can go read the full article, dig in a little deeper if you're interested, and I encourage you to do so. So today's article comes from Bloomberg.com. It's entitled 5 Top TV Producers Explain How Streaming Changed Their Jobs. This article was really, really interesting. It's one of those, simple, straightforward articles where the interviewer asks a question and then somebody answers it, and they kind of tell you who's answering based on their last name. It focused on 5 producers, television producers specifically, all of whom either now work exclusively in streaming or have worked in streaming. So the producers that he's talking to are Betsy Beers, who produced Bridgerton and Grey's Anatomy; Mary Viola, who produced Tall Girl; Alan Yang, the producer of Master of None and Tiger Tail; Neil Baer, the producer of ER and Designated Survivor; and Eric Payton, who produces Holy Moly. So he's got 5 different producers, all different backgrounds, and it's a mix of, made-for-TV movies, television shows, even a competition series in Holy Moly. So nice range of backgrounds. And the article kind of starts, it talks about who the producers are, what they've done in the past, and it talks about how there's 1,600 shows a year that are produced. On top of that 1,600 shows a year, there's several hundred movies that are produced every year, and that a lot of them don't go anywhere. And that's not necessarily a commentary on whether or not it's good film or product. It's more a commentary of kind of how it was presented to viewers, when it was presented, what network it was it on the right night. There's a lot of factors that kind of go into whether or not a show is going to be successful. And with all of the changes in viewership and streaming becoming a much larger kind of entity in how we are consuming content. This article was really interesting to me. So one of the first questions that the interviewer asked the producers was the difference between network and streaming. And as I'm giving kind of these answers, I'm going to give you just kind of the general answers as opposed to breaking it down by producer. I encourage you, go to the GSMC television podcast Twitter feed, take a look at the actual interview from Bloomberg.com because I'm just going to kind of Cliff's Notes it. So biggest difference between network television and streaming, no ad break cliffhangers. So typically network television, you got all these cliffhangers that you're kind of writing into every script so that people are encouraged to come back after the commercials. There's no pilots. So apparently streaming networks like Netflix, they don't produce a pilot and a couple of episodes and see how they perform before ordering the rest of the season. They just go whole hog. They order the season, and if the season goes well, then they continue the show, and if not, they just cancel it. So that's a big difference. Network shows, they said, want people to focus on every episode. So they're constantly trying to find ways to get you to come back and continue watching that show week after week, season after season. Whereas with streaming, they don't really worry about that. They're about producing content in streaming, and if the content hits, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. Not everybody has to like it. It doesn't have to be the biggest show on television kind of thing every time. Another question asked was, a lot of content currently is based on books and other printed material and intellectual property. Why is that? And the producers were really kind of straightforward on this, that it's just easier to get product made if the content that it's based on was popular before. It provides kind of like a safety net, and it helps to attract big name talent, big name writers, and can be a lot easier to get done with a larger budget if it's coming from source material that's already shown some sort of commercial success. Another question. Netflix is known to release everything all at once, the entire season, whereas Disney Plus and HBO Max tend to release episodes weekly. Is there a preference? And the producers unanimously were like, yeah, it really doesn't matter if they release it once every week or if they release it all at once, because in streaming, it's not about keeping the people coming back every week. It's more about making that quick hit of buzz. And so if you own the weekend because you release Bridgerton and it becomes, number one on Netflix, that's okay. If you release a show on HBO Plus, like the Q documentary, and you get 2 episodes a week and you're the big thing for 3 weeks, that's okay as well. So it really didn't seem to matter. Another question that was asked was, what's working right now? So what streaming product is working the most? And they said, look, people are looking for poppy. They're looking for escapism. They're looking for super light content. And that's a change because of the pandemic as people have been in it and coming out of it. They want light-hearted, fun things to watch on television. And then the last question that was asked was, what have you seen that makes you optimistic for the future? And the producers talked about diversity in their answers, and how 15 years ago, diversity wasn't even part of the conversation, diversity in casting, writing, so on and so forth. And now that is a much more prevalent in the conversation, and it's much more prevalent in kind of what they're seeing in writing rooms on shows like Master of None, which was very diverse with only one white writer in the group. And so that was something that they saw as a positive thing, that people were more open to different points of view. And so they were getting that in their productions. So that in a nutshell, there's several more questions. I kind of cherry picked my top 5.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Television Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.
Let me know. I would really appreciate it. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social medias. I thank you so much. See you next time.